So we're on the third line from the top of Daf Ayin Gimel. Boy minei mirav sheshus. The question was asked to Rav Sheshus. We're talking about the laws and the status of an orel who hasn't been circumcised. Orel mahu be maser. Now, for a long time, the Gemara is going to assume up until Daf Ayin Daled that this is only relevant to Maser Sheni. Maser Sheni is separated on years 1, 2, 4, 5, and 1, 2, 4, 5 of the 6 years of the Shemitah cycle. Although Maser Rishon is separated all 6 years of the Shemitah cycle. But Maser Rishon is what we call Chulin, except for the Shita Rabbi Meir, which the Gemara is going to pick up on Daf Ayin Daled. And now we're going to go into the Shita of the Chachamim, that there's no Kedusha to Maser Rishon, there's only Kedusha to Maser Sheni. And the Gemara wants to know an Orel who is excluded from Truma, what's his status vis-a-vis Maser Sheni? And here's how the Gemara analyzes the question. Ki hechi diyolef Pesach mi Maser Sheni le'inyan aninus. We have an equation between Pesach and Maser Sheni. And what we're going to try to analyze here is whether that equation goes in two directions. You know, you have a one-way street and a two-way street. So we're going to try to figure out if it's a two-way street. The one way, which is clear, that's not an issue, is that Pesach is derived from Maser Sheni. Maser Sheni is the Melamed, is the teacher, and Pesach is the Nilmad, is going to be derived from Maser Sheni. The Torah tells us explicitly in the parsha of Maser Sheni, which is in Kitavo, in Vayikra, in Dvarim, that an Onen who's lost one of his close relatives is enjoined from eating Maser Sheni. In fact, when the person recites Vidui Maser Sheni, one of the things that he claims is that Lo achalti ba'oni, I didn't eat it while I was in Aninus. And now we're going to derive Pesach from Maser Sheni, that just like in Maser Sheni, an Onen is excluded from Achilas Maser Sheni, so too an Onen is excluded from Pesach. And he cannot partake in the eating of the Korban Pesach. And now the question is, can we take this equation in the opposite direction and derive Maser from Pesach? In which case Pesach becomes the Melamed and Maser becomes the Nilmad. And what we know about Pesach is that an Orel is excluded from eating Korban Pesach, and that's explicit in the Torah in Parshas Bo, in the Parsha of Pesach. So the Gemara is suggesting in the first side, in this suffix, Yolif Nami Maser Mi Pesach. Let's go the other way around, sort of like a mirror image that reflects two-directional. And now we're going to derive that just like an Orel is excluded from Korban Pesach, so too an Orel is excluded from Maser Sheni, because this equation between Pesach and Maser Sheni. O Dilma, the other side of the suffix, is that perhaps we could derive Pesach from Maser Sheni, but not the other way around. We do not derive Maser Sheni from Pesach. Why? Because Chomer mikal yolif, but kal mi chomer lo yolif. We have a principle that you could derive chumras from the more chomer case, but not the other way around. So Pesach is more chomer than Maser Sheni in many different ways, because Maser Sheni may have some element of kedusha, but it's not kodshim, it's kodshei gvul, basically. I mean, you take it to Yerushalayim, you eat it, you don't take it to the Mikdash. Whereas Korban Pesach is a carbon that's shechted in the Azara and has Kedusha's carbon. So if you want to establish, for example, that an Onen is excluded from Korban Pesach, you could derive it from Maser Sheni, because then you're deriving Chomer from Kal. But the flip side, that the Torah was Machmir in Korban Pesach and excluded an Orel, that doesn't prove that an Orel is excluded from Maser Sheni because Maser Sheni is a lower level of Kedusha. Amar Lahu, and Rav Sheshes responded to those who asked him this question, Tinisua, we have it in a Mishnah. So now we're going to quote a Mishnah. This Mishnah appears twice in Chas, once in Bav Metzia, and once in Bikurim. The actual Mishnah is in the second chapter of Bikurim, but it's also quoted in Bav Metzia, Daf Nun Beis, Amid Beis. And we're going to be studying this Mishnah for quite a while. Now, the Mishnah is going to make a number of different comparisons and contrasts. The first comparison is between Truma and Bikurim. And this is going to reflect the Shita of the Chachamim. We'll soon see that there's a dissenting view, but the Chachamim, the Rabbanan, hold that Bikurim are called Truma. So these are your first fruits that appear on the trees, and you have to bring from the first to the Beis HaMikdash, and you give it to the Kohen. And there's an equation between Truma and Bikurim, because the Torah, when it describes Bikurim, it uses the term Trumas Yodcha, as we'll soon see. So the Torah explicitly calls Bikurim Truma to teach us that Chayovim Aleim Misa, that just like a Tameh, who if he eats Truma when he's Tameh, he is Chayav, and he does it deliberately. He's Chayav Misa B'dei Shamayim, and in addition to that, he has to pay the Kohanim not only Keren, the value of the Truma that he ate, but also Chomesh. He's got to add another 20% on top. So too, Bikurim, insofar as Bikurim are called Truma by the Torah, Trumas Yodcha, they have the same Chumrah of a Chiyuv in a case of Mezid, of Misa B'dei Shamayim, if he eats the Bikurim B'Truma, B'Tuma, and to add a Chomesh, V'Asurim L'Zorin. And a non-Kohen is not allowed to eat Truma or Bikurim, and if he does so, he's Chayav Misa B'dei Shamayim. Tosas has a kasha here. What's the chiddush of Asurim L'Zorim? You already just told me that you chayav a chomesh. When are you chayav a chomesh? Not if you're a Kohen. You're chayav a chomesh if you're a zar. So for sure, it's also for a zar to eat truma, and therefore ipso facto bikurim. Why do you have to spell out asurim lizarim? So Tosas answers that this Mishnah is this famous Mishnah of Chatzi Shir, that even though a zar is enjoined from eating truma and bikurim, that's only a shir. That would be only a kizayis. But what about a chatzi shir? So that's what the Mishnah here is coming to tell you, that the Isser of Zarus with regard to bikurim applies even to chatzi shir. Now, at the end of this Mishnah, if I just fast forward for a second, I don't want to skip all that we have to do. The Mishnah is going to say, Masha ein kein b'maser sheni. So everything that's listed in this Mishnah as being common to both Truma and Bikurim is in contrast to the exclusion of Maser Sheni. So, for example, Maser Sheni is mutal lizarin. Obviously, if I bring my Maser Sheni to Yerushalayim, I'm not a Kohen. So there's no such thing as an Isus Zorus if a non-Kohen, that's by Truma and Bikurim, but has no application to Maser Sheni. And furthermore, Vehem Nichsei Kohen, that what you have to do with Truma or with Bikurim is you have to transfer it over to the Kohen. It's Matnas Kahuna. And once you give it to the Kohen, it belongs to the Kohen. So the Kohen, for example, could take this truma and he could give it to a woman and say, "I sleep at truma zu." Or, for example, if he wants to buy avadim, karkos, and anything, even a behemoth may, he can purchase it with truma. Truma is not also no, it's nichsei Kohen. And it's not limited to achila and shasiyah. The Kohen could enjoy the benefits of the truma and the bikurim and be nene from them in any way, in any shape, in any form. Now, in the case of Masechet, what you're allowed to do with Masechet is simply achila, shasiyah, and sicha. But if a person would give Masechet to a woman, again, I'm assuming this is outside of Yerushalayim. I don't know about Yerushalayim, but outside Yerushalayim, then it would not be a valid Kedushin because it's not considered full ownership, like in the case of Truma that was given to a Kohen. Furthermore, the Mishnah is going to contrast Truma and Bikurim on the one hand with Masechet on the other hand with regard to Tarovis. Supposing you have a mixture in which Truma fell into Chulin. In the cases of Truma and Bikurim, Olim bi echadu meya, which means if, let's say, your truma is called 1, let's say a volume 1, whatever that 1 is, then you'd have to be mavatal it with 100. So it'd be 1 into 100, 100 times 1. That's called olim bi echadu meya. So you're going to need 100 times the volume of the truma in the chulin. And by the way, even after bittul, if let's say you have that ratio of 1 to 100, you would still have to pay the Kohen the value of the truma that got mixed up with the chulin, because although you're now a zar is allowed to eat this mixture because the truma is betela, but nevertheless there's still a chiyuv mamon to pay up the Kohen for the value of the truma. Now, what's the deal in Masechet that got mixed up with Chulin? So here we have a machlokes between Rashi and Tosfos. Rashi holds that if Masechet gets mixed up in a tarovas, all you need is rov. Now, and I don't want to get too far afield here, but even the requirement of rov is probably only derabanan. On a doraisa level, you would have echad b'shnayim, and that has to do with a mixture called min b'mino. Anyway, Tosfos Shita and many other Rishonim hold that Masechet is a davar she'ein bo ein lo matirin. And the Meiri says, what are you talking about? It says, davar she'ein lo matirin, bring it to Yerushalayim and you'll be matir. And the question is, why did Tosfos and other Rishonim reject the Meiri and they hold that there is bittul in Masechet? We have a principle of davar she'ein lo matirin mafil be'elef lo batel. So Rav Soloveitchik said in the name of his father, Rav Moshe, that the Rishonim hold that a davar she'ein lo matirim means that there's a matir. But in the case of Masechet, the Haval Yerushalayim is not a matir. It means that the Torah only prohibited Masechet out of Yerushalayim, but not in Yerushalayim. But there's no matir, so it's not a davar she'ein lo matirim. Then we go on to unim rechitzas yadayim. This is the Gzeira L'Chacham called Yodayim Shnios L'Tuma. In other words, the Rabbanu were afraid that your hands may have come in contact with some Tuma. They gave it a din of Sheni L'Tuma. And there is a concept called Shlishi L'Tuma. We learned about it once in Masechet Shabbos. But again, Shlishi L'Tuma is a very unique category that applies to Truma and Bikurim, but not to Chulin. Chulin could only become a sheni l'tumah. That's the maximum ceiling level. There's no such thing as a shlishi bechulin. There's only shlishi in kodshim and in truma and bikurim. Now, Ma'aser Sheni, from this perspective, is equal to chulin, and it does not have a tumah of shlishi, and therefore yadayim would not be a problem for Ma'aser Sheni. Harev shemesh. Now we're talking about a person who became tameh, and he's ready for Tara. He goes into the mikveh. He needs sunset, or Teisach Kochavim, more likely. And such a person, until Teisach Kochavim, on the day of his tefillah, is enjoined from eating truma and bikurim. However, he would be permitted to eat Ma'aser Sheni. And this is based on a Gemara later on, a Daf Ayin Daled Amid Beis, that Tful Yom is mutter b'Ma'aser Sheni. He's also b'truma bikurim, but mutter b'Ma'aser Sheni. Hare elu b'truma bikurim mashenkim Ma'aser Sheni. So Rav Sheshes is going to be medayek from this Mishnah that there's no contrast between truma and bikurim on the one hand and Ma'aser Sheni on the other with regard to an orel. We know that an orel is enjoined from eating truma and bikurim, which is equal to truma. And we have long yalfusas that we discussed on Daf Ayin Beis, Ayin Gimel, to derive that conclusion. And we're wondering whether an orel is enjoined from eating Ma'aser Sheni. Well, if an orel would be permitted to eat Ma'aser Sheni, argues Rav Sheshes, why wasn't that listed in the Mishnah as one of the contrasts between truma bikurim on the one hand and Ma'aser Sheni on the other? In Isa, if you're going to tell me that an orel is allowed to eat Ma'aser Sheni, argues Rav Sheshes, Mishnah, the Mishnah should have added to this list of contrasts orel aser bahem, meaning in truma and bikurim, Masha enkim and Ma'aser Sheni is permitted to eat Ma'aser Sheni. So from the fact that the Mishnah omitted the discussion about an orel, we derive the conclusion that an orel is enjoined not only from eating truma and bikurim, but also from eating Ma'aser Sheni. Which means that we derive Ma'aser Sheni as far as an orel is concerned from Pesach. The Torah says explicitly that an orel is enjoined from eating the korban Pesach. We have an equation between Pesach and Ma'aser Sheni, and that is a two-way equation that goes both to derive from Ma'aser Sheni the Isra Aninus to Pesach, and to derive the Isra Orel from Pesach to Ma'aser Sheni. And the Gemara rejects it. And we could already guess why the Gemara is rejecting it, because of the principle called Tana V'Shir. You cannot derive conclusions from a Mishnah or a Brisa from that which is omitted if I can prove to you that there were other omissions and the Mishnah was not giving you an all-inclusive, exhaustive list. Umay Shir Dai Shir. What other Shir is there in this Mishnah that you could prove to me that the Mishnah omitted certain contrasts between Bikurim and Truma on the one hand and Ma'aser Sheni on the other hand? And the Gemara answers, Shir de Kotoni Seifa. I'm going to prove to you from the Seifa, that very same Mishnah, that the Mishnah is operating with the methodology of Shir and is not enumerating an exhaustive list. And Vashtate in the Seifa, it says in the Seifa, Yesh b'Ma'aser Sheni b'Bikurim Masha Enkein b'Truma. As I said at the outset, this Mishnah is the Mishnah of contrasts. Until now, we've been contrasting Truma and Bikurim as one entity, as one equation, against Ma'aser Sheni. Now, we're going to go into details about the difference between Ma'aser Sheni and Bikurim on the one hand, and Truma on the other hand. Shamaser Sheni v'Bikurim te'urim avas makom. The halacha is that Bikurim, the Torah says, v'avesem shama olosechem v'zivchechem v'esmasosechem v'estrumas yedchem, And Trumas Yedchem is a reference to Bikurim. The Bikurim have to be schlepped all the way to the Beis HaMikdash, into the Azora, and they carried it with a tenor, a certain kli, and there was a whole ceremonial procession. And in that sense, there's a very basic commonality between Maser Sheni and Bikurim, because just like Maser Sheni has to be brought to Yerushalayim, so too Bikurim have to be brought to Yerushalayim. There's no such parallel halach in Truma. Truma doesn't have to be brought in Yerushalayim. I can live in Dan or Beersheba, and I will give Truma to the Kohen. No din of Havas Makom with regard to Truma. U'tu'unim vidui. Both Bikurim and Maser Sheni have a requirement of vidui, which doesn't exist in Truma. And how do we know about vidui? Because after vidui, the Torah says, "The Amartu l'fnei Hashem Elokecha bi'arti hakodesh min habayis." That's the pasuk in Maser Sheni in Parshas Ki Savo. And as far as Bikurim are concerned, in the same parsha, the Anisa v'Amartu l'fnei Hashem Elokecha Rami Oved Ovi. Is there any parallel halach of vidui with regard to Truma? So the truth is that there is vidui in Truma. That's what's confusing about this Gemara. Because the Mishnah in the 5th parak of Maser Sheni has a drasha on the pasuk in vidui, where it says, "V'gam nisativ zu truma u'trumas maser." So now we have to introduce another concept. There's something called agav. Now we know that agav exists in Choshen Mishpat, in the laws of Kinyanim, in the Bavas. You know, you buy metaltal agav karka, so you make a kinyan on the karka, and memeli you kone the metaltal, whether it's tzrurim or ain't tzrurim, whatever it is, but it's a nachshlepper. And here we have a parallel halach of a nachshlepper. Once you're reciting vidui on Maser Sheni, then you recite vidui on Truma. He says it's only an agav vidui shel maser. Tekevan shemisvad al maser misvad al akol. Avol b'truma b'fnei atzmo lo matzinu vidui. So obviously this is a sugya that would have to be studied at great length. Why is there a halacha of agav, the vidui of Maser Sheni? You're chayav to recite vidui on Truma. The asur lionen. In Maser Sheni, the Torah says, "Lo achalti bioni mimenu." Bikurim have a hekesh of Maser Sheni, and that we're going to see on Amud Beis. However, there's no halacha of an iser onen with regard to truma. An onen is allowed to eat truma. The Rambam, by the way, has a separate drasha from which he derives that bikurim are asur b'ninus on the pasuk v'samachta b'chol hatov. Now, this sefer reflects the shita of the Tanakama, of the Chacham. However, and we'll see the analysis in just a minute, Rabbi Shimon is the dissenting view matir. According to Rabbi Shimon, there's no iser onen in the case of bikurim. The Torah says that an onen is enjoined from Maser Sheni, but not bikurim. Furthermore, Rabbi Shimon disagrees, and he says chayavim b'biur and Rabbi Shimon poter. Whereas the Chachamim say that there's a requirement of biur in the case of bikurim. The Torah says biur and maser, and we equate, the Chachamim equate bikurim to Maser Sheni, and therefore bikurim require biur. And Rabbi Shimon poter. Rabbi Shimon basically holds that we don't have an absolute equation between bikurim and Maser Sheni. So now the Gemara wants to prove from this sefer that the Mishnah is operating with the principle of Tana V'Shir. How do we prove this? V'ilu asur levar mehen b'tuma. Lo kitani. Okay, I'm just reading two words from the next Amud. Lo kitani. Here's another contrast between Masechet and Bikurim. And it's not mentioned over here. I'm sorry. Between Masechet and Bikurim on the one side of the equation and Truma on the other side of the equation. What happens to the case of Tuma? What do we mean by Tuma? So we could talk about Tuma in three different contexts. We have Tuma if Masechet contracted Tuma, Tuma if Bikurim contracted Tuma, and Tuma if Truma contracted Tuma. So that's cases A, B, and C. In the first two cases, namely, if you have, let's say, Peiros of Masechet, or in the second case, Peiros of Bikurim, they contracted Tuma, also levarmi. What does that mean? Let's say I have Zaysim of Truma or Bikurim. By Bikurim apply to all Shivas Haminim. Zayis is one of the Shivas Haminim. And now he takes the Zayis and he extracts the oil from the Zayis. And then if an event the Zayis contracted Tuma, or more precisely, the Shemen Zayis contracted Tuma. So I now have either Masechet or Bikurim of Shemen, that's Tomei. Now I light up the Shemen, as we do with olive oil, and I want to benefit from the light of the candle. The candle is made of Shemen Zayis of Bikurim or Masechet Shenitmu, also. And the chiddush here is you have something that's not roy lachili, you're not allowed to eat Masechet or Bikurim B'tuma. We'll see about getting malchus for that, if you violate that Isur. So you would think, well, look, if it's not roy lachili or l'shia, why can't I benefit from it through hadlaka? It's tamei, but I could be madlik the shemen as a ner. No, it's also levar mehem b'tuma, even though it's a roy lachila. Ein omer, we don't say that hoil v'ein efsharut lechol me'aperos sorry nitma kein isu lahadlik menes haner. Hare yesh mitzvahs asay lechol as Masechet of Bikurim kol shenemar. With regard to Masechet, it says v'achalta, and we derive from the pasuk v'achalta that you're not allowed to use peiros of Masechet for any other purpose whatsoever, even after they contracted tumah, even to burn them and benefit from the or, from the lokas haner. And this is not so in the case of Truma. If Truma contracts Tuma, then there's a mitzvah of Sreifas Truma Tmeya, and you're allowed to benefit from the Sreifa. As the fire is going up, you could heat up your cholent on top of the fire.